We've been talking in this episode of Skeptic Check on Big Picture Science about a seemingly growing interest in astrology. The Greek roots of the word astrology, astro, meaning star, and logos, meaning study. And after all, every culture has looked at the sky, seen the stars, and thought that they might have some profound effect on their lives that were somehow connected to them.
But despite the fact that they both use the Greek word astro, astronomy is different from astrology. Astronomy today refers to the scientific study of the stars and anything else in the cosmos. But both astronomy and astrology share some common terrain, namely the solar system. So both astronomers and astrologers might refer to Mars being in retrograde, for example.
So for an astrologer who believes that each planet somehow wields energy and influence on individuals, Mars being in retrograde might mean a waning of your passion. But I would argue as an astronomer that Mars being in retrograde is actually more interesting for another reason. This optical illusion gives us an important hint about the structure of our solar system.
Because the planets are, if you will, on a kind of racetrack where each planet has its own lane going around the sun, sometimes we overtake a further out planet which is driving slower or on a bigger track. So imagine you're on a race course and your car overtakes another car in an outer lane, then it will look to you like the outer car is going backwards.
Astronomer Andrew Fracknoy agrees with our house astronomer Seth that astrology is not science and that there's no mechanism for how the position of the planets at the time of your birth could possibly influence your future behavior or attitudes. However, as we heard, the fact that astrology is not science is irrelevant to those who follow it and say that it works.
So how do we know that astrology is not science? I mean, what does it mean to say that it works? And is there any harm in believing that? Professor Fracknoy has given a lot of thought to these questions over the decades as he's witnessed American popular attention to astrology wax and wane.
There have been great waves of interest in astrology, going all the way back to the coronation of Queen Elizabeth, of all things. That was one of the times when there was tremendous press interest and for a long time not much news. And so the press got the idea of interviewing British astrologers, and that went in those days viral, and there became a lot of interest in astrological predictions. In the 1970s, when New Agey things were popular, again, astrology enjoyed a kind of renaissance. And then things have gone up and down in terms of the public interest surveys, showing that there's been times of great interest and times of lesser interest. And I think we're at a place now where there's so much uncertainty in the world that all kinds of strange beliefs seem attractive for the moment.
Can I take it from your response that you're sympathetic to this trend, or do you have some other thoughts considering the fact that you are an astronomer?
Well, I'm sympathetic to the fact that a lot of people are confused and searching for answers. I'm not particularly sympathetic to taking a view of the universe which is not based on facts. I think astrology masquerades in some way as a scientifically based belief system because it uses the planets and the constellations and other things that people associate with our scientific view of the world. But it only masquerades as that. In fact, it's an old superstition based on a belief system that got outdated thousands of years ago.
And what was that belief system?
Well, so this is, I think, what might surprise people coming from an astronomer. I think astrology was actually a great leap forward in human thinking thousands of years ago. So I'd have our listeners sort of think back to what life was like 3,000, 4,000 BC. Right? Life was very different from today. There was no modern science, no modern medicine. Life was short. Life was difficult. Life was filled with disease. And it was tremendously unpredictable. And that was the hardest part, that sometimes the very nicest people in your village died all of a sudden from a terrible disease, and the most horrible people lived to be 80. And there seemed to be no sense or rhyme to how people were predestined, in a sense, to live or die.
But humans want to know the reason, the cause for events.
Exactly. Humans wanted someone to blame. And so they, of course, picked on the gods. They decided the gods were the ones who were responsible. And so it became pretty interesting and maybe necessary for the human psyche for us to begin to have a way to read the will of the gods. And that's what astrology is about. In those days, people looking at the sky noticed that although the sky turned once a day in a regular way, because now we know the Earth is turning, in addition to the regular movement of the stars, there were 7 power objects that had their own separate ability to move through the sky. And very naturally, people began to associate those 7 power objects with gods. The sun and the moon were the most noticeable of these 7 power objects, but there were also 5 planets that moved separately from the stars through the sky. So important, in fact, were these 7 power objects that people gave a whole new unit of time to them, the week. The days of the week are named after those power objects. In English, the Sunday and Moon Day, which we call Monday, are obvious. The day before Sunday is Saturn Day. So we gave this whole unit of the week, which has no other reason for existing. We gave it because we were paying tribute to these 7 power objects in the sky.
And certainly they have an influence on our behavior. Moon Day is the least favorite day, we could say, for most people.
People love Saturn Day and Sunday, that's right. So as people began to follow these 7 power objects, thinking that they would learn something about the will of the gods by doing so, they discovered something quite surprising. They found that these 7 power objects didn't wander all over the sky. Their motion was confined to a strip of sky, to a zone around the sky. And that immediately began to seem important. Why were the gods confining themselves to that place? There must be something about that zone that's important. Because many of the groups of stars in that zone happen to resemble animals, they gave it a name. They gave that zone a name called the zodiac, which we now pronounce zodiac, but a zoo is where you find a lot of animals. And they thought that that strip of sky was the home of the gods. And then here came the brilliant idea. If at a magic moment in a person's life, we could figure out where each of the gods was in the zodiac, in this home region, then we might be able to figure out what the gods have in store for that person. So what's the magic moment in the life of a person? It's the time they're born. And from this came the very simple idea, but also profound idea of astrology, that if at the moment a person is born, you see where these 7 power objects, these 7 gods are located in the zodiac, their position and their relative position could tell you something about the person's life and destiny. It didn't have to be true to be very powerful. And it then encouraged people to look at the sky more. If by looking at what's happening in the sky, we can begin to get some control of our lives, clearly looking into the sky is something worth doing. And that led in some ways to the development of astronomy as well as astrology.
Of course, as an astronomer, you encourage people to look at the sky as much as possible.
Absolutely. So in a way, astrologers always point this out, astrology at the beginning was good for astronomy. Many of the great astronomers of the past were also astrologers. Ptolemy and Kepler, for example, made extra money by doing astrology on the side. What we then discovered, though, is that this sense of control, leading finally to what we might call modern rational thinking or science, led us to understand the universe in a much deeper way. We now know that Jupiter and Saturn are not gods. They are worlds, fascinating, complicated worlds, and certainly these physical bodies don't care about Madonna's love life or any of the things that we use astrology for.
Well, Andy, what is your opinion then, or what is your reaction to the people who follow astrology who will say that it is not science? They will agree with you on that, but still claim that it works, that it's helpful to people.
Yes, and what people often say when they say that is that it's not that the essence of it works, but that it's a beautiful overlay. It's a way of telling stories. It's a way of finding commonalities. And it's really just psychology, but that this overlay of thinking about the planets somehow helps people. And so, to me, that's an interesting proposition, but it seems to me that psychology already works. Psychology already allows you to tell stories. There's no need for this extra trapping. It's as if I said that the weather was not based on actual conditions in the Earth's atmosphere alone, but was also controlled by demons, sprites, and other supernatural beings, and that this gives us a way to talk about the weather. Well, yes, you could say that every wind was blown by a demon and every rainstorm depends on a sprite, but why do that? It just makes the weather needlessly complicated. We can talk about the weather without this. So same with, I think, looking at your own personality or who you're compatible with. Yes, you could put in this whole extra layer of who's got what sign and where the planets are, but we already have so much psychological depth in our culture and so many ways to talk about our issues. Why bring on this added layer?
And yet it's persisted. Astrology has been a part of some cultures for centuries. Indian cultures, Chinese, and European cultures.
Well, first of all, I would say even longer, not just centuries, but millennia. We trace the origin of what today we would call astrology back to the Babylonians many thousands of years BC. So the fact that something persists and has temptation doesn't necessarily mean it's right. There have been many ideas in human culture that have persisted for a long, long time, but have no basis in fact. What we need to do with anything, particularly like astrology, which claims to have very specific predictions, is to test it. Like anything else where there are claims, the best way to figure out whether the claims are right or not is to say, well, let's do some experiments. Let's figure out whether or not this thing actually works the way the proponents claim it does.
So I understand that you have a few questions that you would pose to astrologers.
I do. One of the things I was asked some years ago was to write an article from a skeptic's point of view about astrology, and I came up with some questions that I think our listeners might enjoy thinking about. So my first question is, isn't astrology a form of bigotry? Because we've learned in our culture that bigotry is judging people by accidents of birth. For so long a time here in the United States, for example, people who are Irish or Italian were looked down upon because of the country they came from. We judge people by their religion, which they have no control over. They're born into a family. So in the same way, your astrological sign or the aspects of your horoscope are accidents of birth, and judging people by them might also, I think, be considered a form of bigotry. Another question I have is, if you read the astrological predictions in the newspapers where the world is divided into 12 categories by your sun sign, what's the chances that 1/12 of the world is going to have the same kind of day? It's really pretty amazing that people think it's very deep to be divided into only 12 bins with all the billions of people in the world.
But it comes back to this question of for the people who would say, okay, we're not saying that it's science. We're saying that this is helpful to me, and maybe it's even fun. So the question to you as an astronomer and a scientist is there any harm in that? Is there any harm in people practicing astrology?
Well, yes. So there are many instances in which people, quite confused about choices in their personal life, in their work life, beset with medical problems, will go to an astrologer because they want someone to give them a definitive answer. And an astrologer can do completely the wrong thing for them. Astrologers have broken up marriages. Astrologers have given people bad work advice. And most particularly, people who go to astrologers and other pseudoscientists for medical help then wind up not getting the proper medical help they need and being much worse off. So very specifically, yes, you can imagine cases where it's not just fun cocktail party conversation, but we're talking about people making crucial life decisions based on this completely unjustified and untestable idea.
Now, we've been talking about the phenomenon of people following astrology, but maybe not considering it scientific. They describe it as being in this gray area of something that works, but it's not science. However, there is a percentage of the American population, roughly half, according to the National Science Foundation, that thinks that astrology is either science or somewhat scientific. And I'm wondering how we make sense of that statistic.
You're referring to the National Science Board, which is funded by the National Science Foundation, doing every couple of years a national science and engineering indicator survey. And they ask questions about a number of beliefs at the fringes of science during that survey. This has been done for years, and the belief in astrology as being scientific has gone up and down. There have been times when more people believe it's either slightly scientific or maybe it's really scientific. Of course, most people are not that good at making distinctions about what exactly is science and isn't science. The fact that it has science words in it might lead people to think it's more scientific. I think you'd have to probe much more deeply to know what percentage of the United States takes astrology so seriously that they guide their lives by it. I suspect we're much lower than 50%. I suspect we're in the 20% range from surveys I've seen of people who actually seriously guide their lives. That's still a lot of people if it's 1/5 of the population, but it's nowhere near half. I myself occasionally read my horoscope in the newspaper just for the fun of seeing how vague and silly it is, and I don't think I've been psychologically harmed by that. So if that's all you do, or if you compare sort of indicators of what your sign is like in the general scheme of things with other friends, I don't think that this is going to cause you tremendous problems later in life. I think it's people who take astrology as so profound a belief system that they guide their actions by it, where I'm a little bit worried about the danger.
I never thought I would ask you this, but Andy, what's your sign?
My sign is do not disturb.
You've had that joke waiting in the wings for a while. Right. Well, now that you shared your sign with us, Andy, you're also, of course, an astronomer. When is the last time that you looked through a telescope, and what did you see?
Well, I look at the sky pretty regularly, just an occupational hazard. It's so nice to look up at the planets and the stars. I don't think that they necessarily have any direct influence on my personal life or on my ultimate destiny. But I think that the stars are mysterious, complex, and in their own way profoundly connected with us. The elements in our bodies were made in the stars. The fate of the universe was decided during the Big Bang. Much of what happens on planets is determined by how stars are born. So these are the kind of connections with the stars, not the astrological ones, that keep me awake at night.
Andrew Fracknoy, thank you so much for speaking with us.
My pleasure.
Andrew Fracknoy is an astronomer and professor at the Fromm Institute at the University of San Francisco. So, as we've heard from Andy, astrology is basically a superstition, but one that, is still present, as many superstitions are. You probably don't like a black cat walking in front of you, or you keep your lucky rabbit's foot in your pocket if you're a professional ball player or something. So maybe that's not so surprising. But what I found particularly interesting was his comment about how it arose, because, life was so capricious thousands of years ago. He mentions people who die at age 25 or whatever, and then some bad guy who doesn't deserve it dies at 85. And this, unpredictability led people naturally to look for an explanation, and the only explanation before science, was the gods did it. Now, today, we understand why some people might die young and other people not. We understand what causes disease. We also understand the planets, that these are worlds of rock and gas and liquids and so forth and so on. And we also understand that they probably don't care a whole lot about us. So that's all changed. And yet, here we are, still paying attention to astrology.
What about the point of whether or not astrology causes harm?
You know, a lot of the potential harm, and you could say there's not much harm in it, like believing in Santa Claus. Is there harm? Here there might be harm because of the opportunity cost. In other words, instead of basing a decision on some sort of logical reasoning or in some cases even science, instead of doing that, you're basing it on a mechanism that's, you know, really no different than throwing dice.
How do we know that there's no mechanism by which the stars and the planets influence our behavior here on Earth?
Well, nobody has ever suggested one that I think works. I mean, to say that they have energy and all that sort of thing, you know, this is just sort of woo-woo talk. That doesn't mean too much. What I worked out this morning was that the gravitational pull of Mars on a, you know, baby who's just been born is less than the gravitational pull of the office building across the street from the hospital. But nobody's casting horoscopes on the basis of those kind of gravitational pulls. So obviously, it's not gravitational. It's certainly not magnetic. Mars doesn't run into the hospital or anything like that. So if you don't have any conceivable mechanism here, if nobody's come up after thousands of years with some idea of how this might work, you have to say, maybe it doesn't work. Okay, well, maybe you don't buy this horoscope stuff, but what about the influence of that big pizza pie in the sky? Some scientists say that it can influence our behavior.
If you believe that a particular phase of the moon will cause you to do a particular thing, it just might.
Self-fulfilling prophecies and other loony behavior next. It's Skeptic Check, Astrology Ascending on Big Picture Science.
Talking in this episode of Skeptic Check on Big Picture Science about why some people follow astrology, even though there's no scientific evidence that the stars or planets have any influence on your love life or career prospects. But as for what governs your nighttime activities, well, that's a different matter.
Tomorrow night's the full moon. You're gonna change. You'll become...
I know. A monster.
The moon's supernatural influence on us is often the stuff of campfire stories and popular lore, but you don't need fur to sprout on your arms to think that silvery satellite exerts actual influence on us.
Unlike the retrograde Mars and the rising Saturnian system, the moon is close enough to exert a significant gravitational force on us. After all, it's the principal cause of ocean tides. Its nighttime glow can, at the very least, scare nocturnal animals into the shadows, and the full moon is bright enough to read a newspaper by. That's something you can't say about Mars or Saturn. So it might make intuitive sense that the moon could cause some loony behavior.
Females on the porch now, she has that caller keeps coming after the caller.
Robberies, murders, psychosis, emergency room visits. Popular belief is that the driver of much of that mayhem, like a zombie operating heavy machinery, is the moon.
And why is it always a full moon or a new moon that's causing trouble? Why doesn't anyone claim that a gibbous moon, a partially full moon, makes them crazy?
Oh, what's happening to me that I feel so unfulfilled? It's like I'm not quite all there. I'm not complete.
It's just a phase. Wait a few days and you'll be fine.
Either way, whether the moon influences human behavior is a popular area of research.
There have been many studies, close to 100, and they've looked at things like murders and suicide, emergency calls, traffic accidents.
As a neuroscientist at the University of Washington, Eric Chudler studies what motivates human behavior. And over the years, one subject about which he's received numerous inquiries from students was proving to be a real stumper.
A common question that they asked me was, why does the moon make people go crazy? And why does it cause all this abnormal behavior? And I didn't know the answer to that question. And so I looked at all the published studies that were peer-reviewed, and I wrote up a website, and I let people see those data. And I said, here's the data. Come up with an answer for yourself.
His collection of scientific studies is as long as the supposedly moon-governed behaviors are diverse. They include aggravated assault, assault in prison, police arrests, calls to police, homicides in a 1-year period, homicides over a 3-year period, emergency room visits, psychiatric emergency room visits, suicides, and panic disorders. And the conclusion that Dr. Chudler hopes his students have come up with for themselves?
The overwhelming evidence is that there is no correlation between the phase of the moon and any of those abnormal human behaviors.
Wait a minute now, because the moon is well known to have influence on the behaviors of many forms of life on Earth. I mean, tidal critters, I think even oysters and stuff like that. So, I mean, the moon is not completely divorced from life on Earth by any means.
Right. There was that recent study that was just published a few days ago about oysters and how oysters regulated the opening and closing of their shell in relationship to the phase of the moon. What they think is going on is that there's somehow a relationship to the light that the moon emits, and that the oyster behavior is somehow tied to the light of the moon. But humans, we have artificial light, and we're just not affected by that. And so you're looking for a reason for a result that just isn't there.
Well, why were you looking? I mean, does the public think that there is a correlation here?
Yes. In fact, there is a very strong belief in some occupations that the moon does have an effect on behavior. Some surveys that have been done has shown that crisis workers, even emergency nurses and doctors, have a strong belief that the moon affects behavior. And that's very interesting, because these are highly educated people who claim that the moon is affecting the behavior of some of their clients. And the hypothesis that I have about why that may be true is that these people see bad things. They see accident victims. First responders, police officers have to go to some horrific events where things happen, and they notice that the moon might be full when these things happen. But if you ask, well, don't these things happen at other times in the month? They say, yes, it does, but we just don't notice. And one other thing is these occupations are very, very stressful. And sometimes these bad things happen for no reason. And so perhaps it's a coping mechanism in some of these occupations that by assigning blame to something like the moon, it helps them cope with these situations and reduces stress.
Now, have you told this to students at the University of Washington? Because I would be kind of interested in what the younger generation might say to this, because they might have their own observations, which suggest that the full moon does have an influence on their personalities or their experiences.
I've spoken to many, many audiences, college students, even high school, middle school, and even elementary school students about the brain. And often I get the question is, well, don't people go crazy when the full moon comes out? And I reference these peer-reviewed studies that show no, if you really look at the data and you look for a correlation between these events, it really isn't there. And the overwhelming evidence with all of these behaviors is that there is no relationship to any phase of the moon and any increase or decrease in any of these abnormal behaviors.
Now, in astrology, and there's a certain segment of the population that takes astrology seriously. Roughly a third to a half of the population in the United States apparently thinks that astrology is either scientific or somewhat scientific. The moon is one of the important players when it comes to a horoscope or other astrological readings, if you will. It controls. at NSA on the day of a terrorist attack, September 11th, 2001.
Almost 3,000 people were murdered. The workforce knew that this was not just a passing crisis. The workforce knew that we had utterly failed the nation. We, under the Constitution, the preamble of the Constitution, government has two primary responsibilities. One is to provide for the common defense, the other is to provide for the general welfare. Here we utterly failed. We had not kept people out of harm's way. We had not protected the nation.
There was a feeling of guilt there because the NSA had information on some of the men who skyjacked those planes that were flown into buildings, but they did not share it with other agencies. Thomas Drake became an eyewitness to how the agency changed.
So I became eyewitness to NSA unchaining itself with the approval and the mandate of the White House, unchaining itself from the Fourth Amendment, literally, and entering into a mass surveillance regime, the likes that history has never seen before.
As he became critical of the agency's failures, he became a whistleblower and faced years in prison for going public with NSA failures. Unlike Edward Snowden, he did not leak masses of documents.
That was one of the fundamental rules, whether it was oral communication, whether it was written, electronic, or later on, even in hard copy, it was all unclassified, period.
What's not appreciated is that Snowden has been as careful in assembling information as he has been in disseminating information.
If I had just wanted to harm the U.S., you know, that you could shut down the surveillance system in an afternoon. But that's not my intention, and I think for anyone making that argument, they need to think, if they were in my position, and you know, you live a privileged life, you're living in Hawaii in paradise and making a ton of money, what would it take to make you leave everything behind?
Thanks to what we've learned from Snowden's disclosures, it seems like all of us have been reduced to the data we convey.
When you engage in an electronic transaction, whether it's with your cell phone, with a regular traditional landline phone, with your credit card, with your computer, the transaction itself, the content of the communications is called content. You know, if you buy something at the store with your credit card, what you bought is considered content. But there are all sorts of electronic trails left, like crumbs, that often have a tremendous amount of very detailed information about you, particularly when it's gathered in mass. For example, who you called, when you called them, how long you were on the call with them, where you made the call from. That type of data collected in mass can reveal an awful lot of information about you.
In May 2014, Washington finally took legal action against cyber spying by China, not the United States, even as some of the Snowden documents revealed that economic espionage is also in NSA's portfolio. The Chinese and U.S. critics laughed at what they called hypocrisy.
The United States deliberately made up facts, using the excuse of so-called stealing of secrets online to indict 5 Chinese military officials. This has seriously violated the basic principles of international relations and damaged Chinese-US cooperation and mutual trust.
Americans think it's okay if we spy on foreigners, but it's not okay if we spy on Americans, as if, you know, the rest of the world has no right to privacy at all.
We are more worried about Al-Qaeda than I think any nation state as a threat to American lives. But nonetheless, I think we have to rein in an agency that has the ability to spy on any innocent citizen with impunity of any country in the world. I mean, when the world becomes the NSA's panopticon, even with a fig leaf of privacy around Americans, that to me does seem unacceptable, and it turns the whole world against this.
Coming up next, the NSA and the press, how spying and intimidation has led America's mainstream media to push back and publish leaks and disclosures that would have once been unthinkable. The press versus the NSA, coming up next in this documentary series on America's surveillance state.
Have you ever wanted to make a bigger impact for Free Speech TV but couldn't think of how? Consider donating a vehicle. Give to the network powered by the people by donating through our Vehicles of Change program. If you have an old car, truck, motorcycle, or RV that you no longer need, call Vehicles for Charity at 866-628-CARS and tell them you'd like to donate it to Free Speech TV. Vehicles for Charity will make arrangements to tow your vehicle no matter where you live. They accept any condition of vehicle, and you may qualify for a tax-deductible credit. The only requirement is you must provide the title for your vehicle in your name. Free Speech TV will then be notified of your generous donation to help our network thrive and grow. It's that easy. If your vehicle has a VIN, we'll take it in. Call Vehicles for Charity today at 1-866-628-2277. Let your unused vehicle drive Free Speech TV forward. Thank you.
Earth Guardians works as kind of a decentralized action and support network. So we have hundreds of different crews that are individually focused on their community issues in like 35, 40 different countries. And the movement has just blown up over the last 3 years because of how much young people see the value in empowering youth to use their voice in their community. A lot of people, I feel, give us a bad rap as a younger generation for like being really apathetic and disconnected and always on our phone. And while some of those things are true, there are a lot of young people that are searching for a way to plug in but don't have an outlet. So Earth Guardians is working to build a platform in a way that looks at how can we inspire young people to use their passion, the things that they love to do, to engage. It's not about all of us being activists or all of us being spokespeople. It's about, you know, whether we are interested in theater or science or, you know, we're entrepreneurs or hip-hop artists. Like, these different methods are avenues to creating change, and we can bring this ideology of making change into what we already love to do.
Hey, I'm John Fugelsang. Does it ever seem like the Democratic Party is sort of like one of those S&M slaves who forgot his safe word? Does it ever seem like the entire Democratic Party is Clark Kent without a phone booth and you want a superhero? Well, you're the superhero you've been waiting for. Keep informed, keep engaged, keep watching Free Speech TV.
We travel the country, discovering beauty, documenting positive action. Could a respectful revolution change the world? It already is.
Hi, I'm Alan Parlier. We're here in Oklahoma City, and in my neighborhood, I spend most of my life trying to help create community around growing food. We moved in this neighborhood back in the middle 80s, and it was struggling pretty hard. There was a lot of crime and crack houses and gangster activity and a lot of boarded up houses, and I really feel like it's important for people to live in a safe and comfortable environment where they know their neighbors and don't feel that they have to live out of fear. And we just stumbled on the opportunity to use growing food as a way to bring the community together, and so now I'm really passionate about growing gardens in the front yard as a model for community organizing.
Every community should have a community garden. It teaches you leadership. I mean, it teaches you food process. It teaches you where your food comes from, how to grow it, how to harvest it, and it lets you know the things that you really like and dislike.
It's really important for us to show that on a vacant lot in a city, it's possible to create a production farm to feed a lot of people. So this is Commonwealth Urban Farms in our neighborhood. on a vacant lot, and we harvest enough for 30 families every Friday here from April 1st to November 30th, and we distribute that food through a CSA, community-supported agriculture as opposed to market-supported, so that a community of people come together. We have 30 families that contribute, and then they get to share in the harvest. Growing food and doing organic gardening and landscaping and composting is a great model for community organizing, and it's a great model for working with youth to help them stretch from their self-identity and their sometimes they're caught in a street kind of self-image, and getting them to spend some time with some worms and some bugs and critters and plants can get them out of that self-image and get them into a more of a community-minded image. And so that's what I do now, is doing gardening and organic gardening and composting, and helping to build a more resilient community with all of the age levels in our neighborhood. The teenagers, the young adults, the elderly adults, the children, everybody can come together around growing food.
The question of who rules America has been debated throughout America's own history. It was originally raised and answered to some degree by the American Revolution in the 1770s that fought for independence from the British Crown so that Americans, at least some Americans, could rule themselves, or at least they hoped they could. We're at Columbia University with Dr. Eric Foner, a historian and writer and teacher here at the university for a long period of time.
The right to own property. I think what is unusual today is two things. One, the degree of inequality. Never before has the very, very top, the 1%, had so much of the national income and wealth in its own hands. And, so that the gap is greater than ever before. And secondly, Occupy Wall Street is not primarily a movement of farmers, of laborers. It doesn't have the same base. People need to learn history. That's part of our job, to know that this issue has been around for a long time. There is nothing un-American about raising the question of economic plutocracy, economic inequality. It's as American as apple pie. And, I think that the Occupy Wall Street people are legitimate heirs of a long and venerable tradition in this country.
Today, the activists of Occupy Wall Street are continuing the fight for independence and economic justice from domination by a small elite in the name of the majority, the 99% of America.
I do think what's been brilliant about the Occupy Wall Street movement is the framing of the 1% versus the 99%. And I think what we basically have is an undemocratic power structure that goes across political, economic, social, and cultural lines.
What kind of impact has Occupy Wall Street had in raising basic questions about the nature of power in America? We asked sociologist Stanley Aronowitz.
It has an impact on perception. It has changed the conversation. The question is whether or not it will be able to change policy. And the argument that I would make is that it should not worry about changing policy in the short run. The only way to change policy in the long run is going to be to create even a bigger movement. And in order to create that bigger movement, what it has to do is it has to ask the question, what kind of a life do we want to lead? What is the good life? What is a vision of the way in which we want to live?
David DeGraw coined the 99% 1% phrase and was an early Occupy organizer. He explained why Who Rules America remains an urgent issue.
So you have big banks and concentrated wealth that's just rigged the political process. Investigating it, we have a country where U.S. millionaire households have $46 trillion of wealth. It's just a mind-boggling number. So, over the past generation, all the wealth has gone to the top. Really it's 1/10 of 1%, more than 1%. But, breaking it down even further, you have 400 people who have as much wealth as 155 million Americans. So that's 400 people who have as much wealth as half the population.
The seeds of a battle that many of the occupiers see as a new American Revolution is not really new, but deeply rooted in the unresolved history of conflict in the United States between those who own and control its resources and those who want economic equality.
So the question is, who rules America?
that's a funny question because then you talk about power. The first thing you have to understand is America is a business venture. Like stolen land, stolen property, capitalism, it's just about making money.
You know, many revolutions start at the top. In other words, the people who began the struggle against Great Britain were merchants in Boston and New York, plantation owners in Virginia. You know, most of the founders in Virginia are slave owners. But what happens is, as the struggle intensifies, they have to generate support among ordinary people. And when you do that, you break open the political system and you open the door for very, very different kinds of demands. Slaves start demanding their own freedom. Women, Native Americans start demanding greater equality. So what happens at the beginning when a more privileged class begins the resistance, that doesn't necessarily tell you how the whole process is going to take place.
This conflict between the 1%, actually the 0.001%, and the 99% had its echoes here in the home of America's anti-colonial uprising, in the back streets of Boston, where a freedom trail today commemorates a massacre by the British and a fight for liberty. And that's where we'll take you next. Was the American Revolution really a revolution?
The British thought it was a revolution, no question about that. It was not a social upheaval in the way, let us say, the French Revolution was, but it certainly overthrew an entire system of government. It replaced the ruling class with another one, so that seems to be what a revolution is about. And it raised these questions of equality in the society. Not just equality in terms of 1% and 99%, but the role of slavery in American life, the status of women in American life. It unleashed a kind of struggle for equality among all sorts of groups, which continued long after the revolution was over.
Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. That's one of the most famous poems of the American Revolution. And here we are in front of the statue of Paul Revere, the man who alerted all of Massachusetts to the British troops coming into their communities. We're on the Freedom Trail in Boston, where the American Revolution is remembered. But what kind of a revolution was it? What actually happened here in Boston back in the 1700s? What have we learned since then? Thousands of tourists and students visit these revolutionary monuments every day, but most have only a foggy idea of what really happened and tend to repeat the mythologies that are taught in their schools. Here was Paul Revere. Paul Revere was one of the great revolutionary heroes. Are you kids here to see the statue of Paul Revere?
Yes, we are.
Can I ask you a question about it? Sure. We're doing a little TV program here. Yeah. Who was Paul Revere? What was this all about? Do you know?
He was a founding father.
Yeah, Midnight Ride.
To warn about the British were coming.
Did you know that he was a very rich businessman, a silver rising, or was it sort of led by elites here in Boston?
Well, both were true. There were popular elements. Ordinary people did resent the British. Ordinary people did participate in riots and boycotts. But there was a 1% back then. The leaders of the revolution both led it and channeled it. They were certainly not above using words like liberty and freedom to deflect and distract people from their own discontents in the colonies.
And their own interests. I mean, the business class of Boston didn't want more taxes on their products. They wanted to compete with the British goods. They felt they shouldn't be taxed. And as a result, there was the original Tea Party here in Boston.
Right. And there were, merchants like John